The Invisible Cracks Before Collapse, Reflections from My Stroke, and the First 20 Years of Diabetes Mismanagement, number 1412, October 30, 2025. Gerald C. Shu, EclaireMD Foundation. Category, Stroke Diabetes. Preface. On September 11, 2025, when I first saw many small, bright white spots scattered across my cerebral microvessel area on the CT scan, I immediately understood what they meant. Those bright dots were not random. They were the visible footprints of my first 20 years of diabetes mismanagement, a period when I was ignorant, and blindly believed that medications alone could manage my chronic diseases. During those 2 decades, from 1990 to 2009, I relied entirely on 3 different types of diabetes: drugs to lower my glucose readings without changing my lifestyle. The medications temporarily improved my surface numbers, but never repaired the underlying vascular damage. They masked symptoms while the disease quietly advanced beneath the surface. That day, sitting in my neuroscience, stroke doctor's office and staring at my own brain scan, I suddenly remembered MIT classrooms in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1973, when Professor Norman Jones taught us about dynamic plastic deformation in structures. He explained how repeated heavy truckloads on a reinforced concrete bridge create microscopic internal cracks that are invisible to the naked eye, or standard X-rays. Over time, these tiny cracks accumulate and weaken the structure, eventually leading to failure under stress, such as during a storm or flood. That mechanical principle became my stroke analogy. My cerebral microvessels had endured decades of silent internal stress from long-term diabetes. Biochemical strain instead of mechanical strain. My earlier lifestyle choices, poor diet, lack of exercise, short sleep hours, and high business stress, plus blindly reliance on medication acted like those repeated heavy truckloads. The drugs disguised the problem, but the internal structure of my vascular system was already weakening, one microscopic crack at a time. When an emotional event triggered a sudden blood pressure spike to 175 mm of mercury on June 21, 2025, it was just like that final, heavy truck crossing the bridge, or the pull of a trigger on a loaded gun. My brain hemorrhage was not caused by chronic hypertension, as some assumed, but by the cumulative metabolic damage from years of uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. With hemoglobin A1C reaching 13%, that had slowly calcified and stiffened my cerebral microvessels. The emotional stress-induced acute hypertension that day merely served as the final trigger of a gun. Like stepping on a buried landmine that had been waiting for decades. Over the past 100 days, I have collected more than 10,000 blood pressure data points, around 20 measurements each day, and only 0.2% of them, 20 data points, were within the range of from 130 to 140 mm of mercury, with none exceeding 150 mm of mercury. My primary physician of 15 years also confirmed that I have never recorded a single systolic blood pressure reading above 150 mm of mercury throughout my entire past 15 years medical history. These consistent findings clearly prove that I have never been a chronic hypertension patient, despite some assumptions made after my stroke incident. After the stroke, my VMT, viscoplastic medicine theory, energy analysis also confirmed what I had sensed from the CT scan on June 21, 2025. More than 91% of my total stroke energy buildup. The true cause came from 1990 to 2009, when I depended on medication alone without lifestyle change to deal with my diabetes. Only 9% came from 2010 to 2025, the period when I reversed my disease naturally, through diet and food disciplines, daily walking, and self-education on chronic diseases without taking any medications, including vitamins. Numbers never lie. My stroke was not a sudden event. It was the visible endpoint of countless tiny cracks formed over decades of neglect. I should never have relied on medication alone, and should have begun lifestyle adjustments much earlier. After several decades, the damage was already done, but I have learned a profound and painful lesson. One that I hope is not too late to save my own life. I now see my brain CT not as a tragedy but as a scientific lesson. It shows how medicine, engineering, and life itself follow the same law of cumulative stress and eventual failure. Prevention is not achieved through temporary fixes, but through sustained balance and continuous maintenance. Scientific justification. Why my self-diagnosis is correct. My reasoning is both scientifically and quantitatively justified. I will explain this conclusion carefully, using my understanding of pathophysiology and my own longitudinal data analysis. 1. My stroke was not from chronic hypertension. Over the past 100 days, I have collected more than 10,000 blood pressure data points, which provide clear and objective evidence. Only 0.2% of my BP readings were above 130 mm of mercury, just 4 readings exceeded 140 mm of mercury, and none were over 150 mm of mercury. This consistent pattern rules out chronic hypertension. True hypertensive patients typically show thousands of elevated readings over many months or years. My data prove that I do not have a chronic hypertensive profile. 2. Why my stroke doctor assumed chronic hypertension. I understand why my stroke doctor concluded that my stroke was related to chronic hypertension. Neurosurgeons and stroke specialists commonly treat patients whose strokes are caused by long-term hypertension. Approximately 80% of all cases, 78.2% based on national data. It is therefore natural for them to generalize this pattern in their clinical judgment. However, in my situation, it was not my doctor's fault. He saw only the final event, a hemorrhagic stroke, triggered by one acute episode, without knowing my decades-long baseline health record. The acute blood pressure surge during my stroke appeared as the visible trigger, but my own long-term dataset clearly disproves the assumption of chronic hypertension. 3. My true stroke mechanism. Based on my self-learned medical knowledge and my VMT, viscoplastic medicine theory, energy analysis results, I can now identify both the root cause and the acute trigger behind my stroke. The chronic cause, representing 91% of cumulative energy buildup, came from my first 20 years, from 1990 to 2009, period, decades of high glucose, insulin resistance, and microvascular damage caused by uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. The recent 16 years, from 2010 to 2025, period's lifestyle adjustment, only representing for 9% of the total stroke energy contribution. The trigger of my recent stroke came from a short-term sympathetic overactivation, emotional stress and transient hypertension that ruptured a weakened brain microvessel. This ratio, 91% chronic metabolic energy versus 9% acute hemodynamic energy, matches both my quantitative VMT research findings and the actual vascular failure based on established pathophysiological logic. 4. Pathophysiological interpretation. My cerebral microvessels had already lost elasticity and perfusion control after more than 3 decades of diabetic injury, glycation, oxidative stress, and endothelial dysfunction. Their walls had become brittle, stiff, and partially calcified. On June 21, 2025, a sudden wave of emotional stress triggered a powerful sympathetic surge that drove my blood pressure up to 175 mm of mercury. For a healthy person, this level might not be dangerous, but my already weakened cerebral vessels could not withstand it. The fragile vessel near the pons ruptured, resulting in a hemorrhagic stroke. The underlying cause was long-term metabolic degeneration from diabetes. The immediate trigger was a brief, sympathetic surge that sharply elevated my systolic blood pressure. By definition, my case did not represent chronic hypertension. 5. Why this conclusion matters. This experience proves that longitudinal, personal data are far more reliable than snapshot clinic readings. It also validates the power of the VMT energy and TDA geometric frameworks, which distinguishes between chronic cumulative causes and acute triggering events, a capability that traditional statistical methods often lack. By combining my 16-year longitudinal dataset with quantitative modeling, I could separate decades of hidden metabolic stress from the final short-term event that caused the rupture. This kind of precision is rarely possible in conventional statistics analysis, based on clinical data. 6. Summary. My self-diagnosis is accurate and evidence-based. I am not a chronic hypertension patient. My stroke represented the mechanical failure of vessels, weakened by long-term diabetic stress, from 1990 to 2009. The rupture was triggered by a brief sympathetic surge, not sustained high blood pressure. The VMT model quantified this clearly: 91% chronic metabolic energy, 9% acute hemodynamic energy. My CT images, longitudinal data, and VMT energy results together form a coherent, scientifically consistent explanation of the real cause of my stroke. Discussion: Connecticut versus MRI in my stroke investigation. Both CT and MRI played complementary roles in my stroke diagnosis and analysis. When I was admitted to Stanford Hospital, the CT scan was performed first. CT uses X-rays to detect differences in density. Calcium strongly blocks X-rays, so calcified microvessels appear as bright white spots, clearly revealing the structural damage that accumulated over years. Although blood vessels are soft tissue, CT with contrast dye provides high spatial resolution and rapid visualization of vascular blockage, hemorrhage, and calcification. CT scan is the best tool for emergency diagnosis and for mapping the extent of vessel rupture or bleeding. However, Connecticut cannot show microlevel tissue damage or soft tissue repair processes. That is where MRI becomes valuable. MRI, which measures water molecule signals, visualizes soft tissues, oxygenation, and edema more clearly. MRI allowed the doctors to evaluate post-stroke tissue viability, inflammation, and early neuroplastic recovery that CT could not display. In simple terms, CT is structure and density. The hardware of the brain and vessels, MRI is function and tissue status. The software and repair mechanisms. From a VMT energy perspective, the CT represented the accumulated strain, the long-term, irreversible energy stored as calcified vessel walls. The MRI represented the dynamic response, the redistribution of energy during the healing and neuroplastic recovery process. Both tools confirmed the same story through different scientific languages. CT showed the end of damage, MRI showed the beginning of recovery. Conclusion: this experience taught me that both medicine and engineering obey the same physical law. Every system fails after long-term stress accumulation if maintenance and adaptation stop. My brain became the structure, diabetes became the load, acute hypertension became the trigger, and the stroke became the collapse. The true prevention of chronic disease does not come from hiding symptoms, but from restoring stability, through lifelong learning, disciplined lifestyle, and respect for the body's warning signals. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article, and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. Shue.